Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about ecological succession, which is defined as the natural process where the structure and species composition of communities and ecosystems change in response to changing environmental conditions. Yeah, ecosystems change, right? Their abiotic conditions change, the biotic conditions change. Some of these changes are favorable for some species, but perhaps not favorable for others. Consequently, over time, ecosystems change in species composition. Historically, ecologists thought this was a predictable sequence of events, where it went from very simple ecosystems to more complex. In fact, they thought it was trending towards a steady state, or what they called a climax community, where there was ultimate stability. Ecologists have sort of redefined this, realizing that perhaps it's a wee bit more complicated. These changes are dynamic. Ecosystems are constantly changing, and it makes it very difficult to predict. Volcanic eruptions, forest fires, floods, all of these things will initiate succession. And to say that there's some sort of preordained sequence of events might be a bit simplistic. The rate of ecological succession is dependent upon three factors: facilitation, inhibition, and tolerance. Facilitation is the process where species promote growth. Certain plant species, through biologic activity, create soil. In doing this, they're creating a platform for growth for future plant species to colonize and utilize. By doing this, they're allowing growth of future subsequent species, which can ultimately outcompete their survival. The opposite of facilitation is inhibition. Tree species like black walnut, for example, give off various chemicals into the soil, and these chemicals prevent the growth of other tree species. This is a nice way of eliminating competition. Inhibition slows the rate of succession. Finally, there's tolerance. With any forest, oftentimes you'll have a canopy. That canopy casts shade on the forest floor. Many species are shade intolerant. However, some species, late successional species, are tolerant of the shade and can grow in the understory. This allows growth. We have two different types of succession, primary and secondary. We're going to look at primary today. We distinguish the difference between primary and secondary based on how it begins. What is the event that caused it, and what are the conditions that start succession? With primary succession, it's in an environment that has not previously been inhabited. In other words, it's a blank slate or an empty canvas. Primary succession begins on rock. There's no soil present, and since there's no soil present, it makes it very difficult and slow for species to colonize. Oftentimes, with no soils, there's no seeds there either. So it's like starting all over. It's a slow moving process where pioneer communities are then replaced by mid successional species, and then finally it climaxes in a forest community. We're going to go through this sequence of events very slowly. So, what are the events that kick off primary succession? Massive glaciers are like giant bulldozers, and they sort of completely obliterate previous ecosystems. By moving through an area, they gouge out all the soils that were previously there and any signs of life. When the glacier retreats or melts, in its wake is bedrock or rock itself. No soil, no seeds, no plants. And so it's like starting all over again. Another good example of where primary succession occurs is on volcanic islands. With volcanic activity, lava is spewed, erupts, flows over the landscapes, cools, hardens, and solidifies, and the next morning you wake up, you're left with this lifeless, barren moon base. It's just exposed rock. So how does life colonize this? Who are the first to arrive on the scene? What are the first organisms or plants that you would expect to colonize this area? We call these pioneer species, and much like the pioneers of the United States, when they moved westward, they had to be pretty hardy to deal with some pretty inhospitable conditions. A plant living on barren rock is going to be exposed to intense sunlight, harsh winds, lots of rain and runoff. So it's really difficult to get a foothold. So you have to be tough. So the first species to arrive are usually lichen. How did they get there? Well, seeds can be blown in from the wind along with spores. Furthermore, a bird could fly over the landscape and defecate on the rock. Within that excrement could be seeds. Anyways, the usual organisms first to arrive on the scene, the early colonizers, are what we call lichen. Now, lichen is actually two organisms rolled into one. They exist in what we call a symbiotic relationship, one of mutualism. Algae undergoes photosynthesis to create stored chemical energy, and the fungus adds surface area, which allows it to collect water. Together they grow and concert, and they grow together, and they grow quite slowly. Other organisms that can be found in early colonial landscapes would be mosses. These are primitive non-vascular plants, also very hardy. And you can see these mosses starting to colonize the terminal moraine of a glacier that's melting. So what do these lichens and mosses do that allows other organisms to colonize the area? They contribute to soil formation. This is a process of facilitation. So not only is the bedrock weathering chemically and physically from being exposed to the atmosphere, but the lichen and mosses also excrete weak acids that chemically degrade the rock. Furthermore, that plant material dies, making organic additions to the soil that accumulate over time, very, very slowly. Depending on climatic conditions, this process can take hundreds to thousands of years. Furthermore, now we're starting to build up this organic material, which catches sediments as it blows over them, and slowly but surely the soil forms. What's next? Mid-successional species. These are organisms and plants that need very little soil to survive, since it is slowly forming, need constant access to sunlight during the day, and ultimately can outcompete mosses and lichens because ultimately they will cast a shadow on this algae and other plant life. Mid-successional species include annual grasses as well as ferns. Once we build up a critical mass of soil, then all of a sudden other species can start to move in. Shrubs and small trees. This is more organic additions to the soil as they die and decay. Then we get pine trees, which are also sun-loving, shade intolerant. And then eventually, once they build up a canopy, they will cast shade on the understory, which will then tolerate shade-tolerant organisms to grow up in the understory. These are what we call late successional species. In our area, they are typically maples and eastern hemlocks. So here's the sequence of events for primary succession. Going from left to right, we start with exposed bedrock. This is how we know it's primary. In this particular case, in a northern island of Lake Superior following glaciation, we had succession that took place over thousands of years, where glaciers wiped away the plant life and soils, leaving exposed rock. Pioneer species colonized lichens and mosses, contributing to the soil formation process. Small herbs and shrubs started to take over. A dense heat mat or shrubby layer emerged. Mid-successional jack pine, black spruce, and aspen, sun-loving trees developed. And then eventually the late successional tree species of which the old school ecologists would call a climax community, balsam fir, paper birch, and white spruce eventually came to dominate the ecosystem. We're going to pause here because next we're going to learn about secondary succession, and then we'll start thinking about modern day perspectives on this natural ecosystem service. Thanks, guys.